And anyway, the whole thing was ridiculous. He'd only come to the DA room to put up some Christmas baubles shaped like Dobby's head. The dream changed. His body felt smooth, powerful, and flexible. This is your scene, Nagini. Are you listening? Are you listening? He was gliding between shining metal. What? Oh, we're rolling? Oh, okay, sorry. Hello, Global Issues class. Dr. Maiden and Nagini here to bring you Global Issues 4.7. This is Nationalism Part 2. Okay, everyone, so this is Nationalism Part 2, the second part of our nationalism section. And the reason that I added this in is because nationalism has different connotations. There's different ways that we use the term nationalism. So in the first lecture, Nationalism Part 1, that was all about us looking at the emergence of new states out of nations. So whether it's ethnic nations, civic nations, and really the idea of state formation, state identity, and the ways in which that happens. We cannot talk about nationalism and not talk about this aspect of nationalism that is literally sweeping the world, okay? So we're going to talk about not only nationalism in this lecture, but a very specific form of nationalism, which we call populist nationalism. Populism, nationalism, and then this form, populist nationalism. So the first slide here is some definitional phrases for you. So let's start with nationalism. A sort of new way that we are framing this term nationalism. Identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. All right, so you can think of some different words, and some of these have more positive connotations, some have more negative connotations. Terms like patriotism, loyalism, xenophobia, ethnocentrism. These are different ways to get at this conception of nationalism we're shifting to, of identification with your own nation's self-interest, even and to the extent of harming other nations' self-interests, okay? Populism then, the definition of populism is an ideology which presents the people, this thing, this grouping that we consider the people, as a morally good force. The people are morally good, and they are contrasted against what we call the elite, and they are portrayed as corrupt and self-serving. So a populist movement would be a rising up of the people to take down or to combat or to oppose the elite, however we're defining them. So we're going to walk through how these two things, populism and nationalism, have come together to create what we call populist nationalism. All right. So we're going to start with conceptualizing nationalism. So you have this reading, Bieber 2018, not Justin Bieber, a very different Bieber, Conceptualizing Nationalism. And they outline 4 typologies of nationalism. So the first one, very popular pretty much in every country, anywhere around the world, latent nationalism. Latent nationalism is things like flags. The fact that I think every car dealership in America flies an American flag on top of it. War memorials, holidays, national holidays, Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, George Washington's birthday holiday, right? All these random holidays that are celebrating figures in U.S. history, Independence Day, a moment in U.S. history. The second form of nationalism then is what we call more virulent nationalism. Virulent nationalism is this idea of seeking to assert the will of an imagined community over a political or cultural space. So virulent nationalism tends to be a little bit more exclusionary, right? That our will is the best that there is, our version of our national identity is the best that there is, and we will assert it on the rest of the nation. So whether or not they believe that this is what our nationalism should look like, we're going to push it really strong. That's a form of virulent nationalism. Other things like civic nationalism, number 3. Civic nationalism is then based on citizenship. the ability of individuals to join the nation. So you can imagine some countries would have civic nationalism much more than they would have other forms of nationalism, especially a country like the US. We have a more civic nationalism because we don't have a really unifying sense of like an ethnic nationalism in this country. Ethnic nationalism, then the fourth one, this idea of basing your nationalism on the myth of a common descent. So this one by nature is less inclusive. So the perfect example of this would be something like a Japan. So we're going to pause here for a second, and I have a video linked down below. And the video here is looking at what does it mean to be a populist. I would like you to pause this video, go down below, follow that link, and watch the populist video, and then we'll come back together and switch over into populism. Okay, I'll see you guys in a second. Okay, so hopefully you watched that video and you found it interesting. A couple of things to highlight from the video is the idea that populism in and of itself is not necessarily good or bad, right? He highlighted in the video the fact that both FDR and Hitler were widely described as populists during the period in which they ruled. Obviously, very different outcomes, very different styles of leadership, initiatives that were pursued, obviously, but both were considered populist leaders. So let's look at the slide, Populism in Practice, and let's walk through a couple of things here in terms of what we can expect to see when a populist movement or a populist leader rises to the forefront. So populist leaders tend to emerge as what we consider the voice of the people, okay? They emerge as the voice of the people. This can be left or right wing. What establishes around a populist leader is a very, very strong cult of personality. And populist leaders tend to become more popular because they'll do things like use colorful, undiplomatic language. A lot of times you'll see populist leaders cursing, right? They'll try and be connecting with like, I'm the everyman too. So even if they're in a fancy business suit, or particular women populist leaders will kind of drill onto this even harder of trying to prove like, I can be just like you, blue collar workers. I can curse and drink beer and etc., right? Of this idea of I have to be the voice of the people. I have to represent the people. And then you have the populist leader on the one hand, but then you also have the creation of what we call the people as this homogenous category of the virtuous and the oppressed. Overwhelmingly, there's this understanding that the people are all underdogs, okay? So they're all, if we're thinking to, any hockey movie that ever has been, that the US has created, right? The team is always this underdog team that rises to the occasion and takes over the established team, okay? We are, the people as a group are the underdogs. The elite then are the third category that you need, the elite. So you have the leader that is leading the people, however you're defining that. It's often very obscure and very like, who are you even referencing? Okay, but the people is just this lump category. Then the leader and the people are fighting against the elite, okay? And the elite are the political, cultural, economic, and media establishment. And again, they tend to be painted as this homogenous entity. So what a populist leader will do is they will very forcefully come out and use rhetoric arguing that the elite, writ large, the whole of the elite, the whole of the political, cultural, economic, and media establishment do not support the people. The whole of the elite are corrupt and self-serving. They only support large corporations. They support foreign countries. They support immigration, ruining our country. Depending on what side of the aisle you're on, left or right, you will play up different of these tropes that is more relevant to your base. So if you're leaning right, you'll be talking about how the elite are supporting illegal immigration and they're just letting them come in and they don't pay taxes and they're giving them all these incentives and blah, 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 blah. So you'll do it on that side. Whereas left-leaning might be talking about large corporations and how they're, big government bailouts to large corporations. We're seeing this right now with the coronavirus stuff. The expectation then becomes that the leader is the only one who can beat the elite. And again, all of this, when it comes to populism, it's very obscure, it's very poorly defined, all of these terms. Who are the people? Who are the elite? What do you mean you're gonna beat them, or you're gonna like win? Like what does that even look like? How do you beat the cultural establishment? How do you beat, the media establishment? What does that actually look like? And they don't have really any plans for how they plan to do that. They're just fighting the good fight on our behalf, okay? So maybe if you've been paying attention during the past couple of election cycles, you've seen some of this rhetoric, whether it's been from the left or from the right, okay? This is the important point though, when you think about why are people so concerned about the rise of someone like a Donald Trump, okay? Why are we so concerned about the rise of populist nationalism around the world? Because that's what we're going to talk about as well, is the fact that this is happening all around the world. And for political scientists, if you ask anyone in our department why we have concerns, legitimate concerns about the rise of populist nationalism, whether it comes from the left or the right, is the fact that populism overwhelmingly leads to democratic backslide. Overwhelmingly. So when a populist leader actually secures power, because this happens all the time, you can have a populist movement, but they don't actually win their election. This happens all the time. But if they do win their election and they take over, so in our case, for better or for worse, I'm not trying to come off as too political here. We just have to be using the example that we have, which is President Donald Trump. So President Donald Trump is an unabashed populist. He has been very straightforward. He has used the term many times before, referring to himself as a populist nationalist. Okay, so I'm not pulling back some type of secret curtain here. He embraces it. So the fact that he is now in power, some of the fears that we have as political scientists of expectations of what we might see. So I'm going to walk you through from the literature things that we expect to see. And I want you to have in your mind the Trump presidency and see if any of this rings any bells, okay? So the first one is that populist leaders almost immediately will attempt to undermine independent institutions. So in particular, they will vehemently attack the media. They will vehemently attack judiciaries because they consider both the media and free and independent judiciaries to be a hostile threat to what a populist leader would refer to as the will of the people. So first thing out the gate, you will see them very strongly attack the media, attempt to limit the media, threaten to cut off access to the media, threaten to remove licenses from media groups that are oppositional or publishing things that the populist leader doesn't like, removing press privileges from media. Does any of this ring a bell? Right? This has been the story of the Trump presidency from day one, right? He got into it with the media day one, arguing about the size of his inauguration crowd, okay? The second thing that you will see, curtailing independent media sources and praising / supporting loyal media sources. So again, if we're looking at the example of President Trump, overwhelming support for Fox News and widespread condemnation of literally any other media source, and coining the term fake news and having that spread around the world like wildfire, to the fact that most right-wing populist nationalist movements at this point are now all using that same terminology, even in English. So even if it's a Hungarian right-wing movement, they'll be speaking in Hungarian and then switch and you'll hear the word fake news in English, right? The third thing that you will see populist nationalist leaders do, or populist leaders do when they gain power, is they will increase the power of the executive. They will work very hard to increase the power of the executive. They will work to erode checks and balances. The other thing that you'll see are things like attacks on individual rights, and to quote someone for like J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill, he said that populism will lead to democratic backslide and that you have to begin to fear what he called, quote, the tyranny of the majority. So it's this idea that if you have a majority, even if it's a simple majority, even if it's only like 32% of the population, but that's the largest majority that you have, even if they are in control, you can get what we call a tyranny of the majority. So if they are able to make decisions through their populist leaders that impact the rest of the country in a negative way, so whether it's things like immigration policies, corporate bailout policies, whatever it is, putting more religion into, that's something that you'll see in a lot of different country case studies, where they were more secular, but you're seeing more, as particularly with right-wing movements, more religion being brought back into state systems. And it may be that you're living in that country and that's not your religion, but there's a tyranny of the majority that you have to fear, that they're in power, they have control, they're going to do this, and you got to watch out. Okay, so these are just some of the things that you can expect to see with the rise of populist regimes when they actually take power, is democratic backsliding. We're going to pause again and we're going to watch our second video. And this second video is talking about whether populist nationalism is on the rise. So link down below, it's video number 2. Watch that and we'll come back together. So we're going to do, we have these are our last 2 vignettes for the semester. 2 vignettes here. I would love for the 2 of you to be commenting down below. The 2 cases that were mentioned, they've been mentioned in both videos now. So the first one, I think this is Lana, right? You have Brexit. So if you want to just talk to us a little bit, there's so much that you can say about Brexit, right? But focus more in your comment below about these populist nationalist elements and how that kind of took rise in the UK and led to the referendum vote, right? So how did this populist nationalist party come into power and start using rhetoric, start using the media to push for this idea of we should be a free and independent Britain? The other one then, I think this is Benjamin, right? Benjamin, don't you have the national rally for France? Go ahead and make your comment down below as well. And the same thing here. So the national rally has had some struggles in France because of its unabashed right-wing populist nationalism, very, very strong opinions about immigration, among other things. They have had to actually go through a process of rebranding because of a lot of the negative press that they were getting and challenges that they were facing. Comment down below with anything you think that you found interesting for us about the rise of this right-wing populist nationalist regime in France, and whether or not you actually see them being successful, right? Because they keep winning larger and larger percentages of votes. Could it be that the national rally could be leading the French government? Is that something you foresee based on the successes they've had at this point, particularly since their rebranding strategy? All right, so those are just 2 interesting cases for you guys to check out below, Brexit and national rally in France. So the last thing that we'll end here with this question of, is populist nationalism on the rise? And the problem is, how do we measure it? That's a big challenge, because this is a political science class, that we're interested in that, right? We're interested in measurement. We're interested in understanding, okay, how do we know? How do we measure if populist nationalism is on the rise? So there are a couple of things going back to the beginning where I mentioned the Bieber article that you had assigned for today. If we end with Bieber again, ways that we can measure it. They put forward some interesting attempts of, these are things that we can look at to understand, is a country moving that direction? So you can look at something like trust in other nations. Are there perceived outgroups, in-groups and out-groups? Who are we friends with? In the case of, again, it's just unfortunate. I feel like I'm being very political here. I'm not trying to be political. It just is a fact that Trump is our president, and so he's a good case study for us to look at for this. Trust in other nations. If you look at what's been going on with trust kind of breaking down with some of the partners that we have traditionally had, even something that was, really upsetting on the world stage, like what happened at the G7, where they basically, 4 leaders of the world were caught with hot mics at a reception laughing about Trump. And he found out about it and left the G7 meeting early, right? His feelings were hurt and he left. That is not the first time that that has happened. So trust and friendships have eroded between partners that were our most strongest allies, democratic allies, and instead he is shifting to some other partners. That's very interesting to be looking at. Pride in the nation is another way that we can measure it. Isolationism. Are we doing things like pulling out of international organizations that we have long been a member of? So things like Trump wanting to get out of NAFTA, Trump wanting to get out of NATO. There are, from our discussions, we can understand from the perspective that we have, having studied international relations together, and particularly having looked at it from all these different theoretical perspectives, we understand a more nuanced look at. There's a lot of reasons why that makes sense that have nothing to do with populist nationalism, that we would get out of something like NAFTA or try to renegotiate it, or get out of NATO or try to renegotiate it. But for a lot of people, the lay perspective can just be, that's a rise in isolationism, okay? We have a little bit more nuanced understanding of that at this point to say, maybe or maybe not. There's ways that we can look at this differently. Other things like state identity versus ethnic identity, rise in violence and hate crimes. Overwhelmingly, particularly with right-wing nationalist, populist nationalist movements, when they gain power, you do see a rise in violence and hate crimes. And unfortunately, that has been not only during the time of his campaign, but since he has been in office with Trump, there has been a very, very noticeable rise in violence and hate crimes, particularly targeting Asian Americans, even before everything is happening with coronavirus, where he keeps calling it the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, the China virus. That in and of itself is one example, but even during his election, there were a lot of rise in hate crimes, particularly against Asian American females, being targeted by older white men that are often shouting things like, it's Trump's America now, Trump 2020, etc., and attacking them on the street. So there has definitely been a rise in hate crimes as a response to the rise in right-wing nationalism here in the US. And it is a trend that is felt around the world. Any of these countries that we're looking at where there's a rise in right-wing nationalism, there tends to be a rise in violence and hate crimes, particularly against minorities, whether that's LGBT, ethnic minorities, gender minorities, etc. All right. So we're going to stop there. I know this is a tough one because it can feel pretty close to home for us because it is the situation we are in now. And again, I'm not trying to be political so much as political science-y about this. There is absolutely a science to this that we should be concerned. As political scientists, as students of political science, we know what this looks like. We have evidence over many, many years across many different cases to be legitimately concerned about the rise of populist nationalism, whether it's from the left or the right. And it's important, given the world that we live in today, that we are talking about it. It can be tough because it can feel more like politics than political science. But I encourage you to talk about it and to be thinking about it and to be putting on this IR hat as you're looking at some of these current world leaders and situations and thinking more like a political scientist about it than just an American part of the people, right? Comment or question down below if you have something that you're wanting to say, if there's other examples that you're thinking of, other things that you want the class to know about. And otherwise, I will see you guys for the next lecture. All right, have a great day.